Hey YouTube, I just finished making this video and my sound was terrible, so I get to start all over again. But I want to talk a bit today about the first theology, John, and the character of John and the gospel of John and those package of texts. The very first theology, as I've stated before, I'm fairly certain is Johannine, and the only reason we call it that is because it's related to the John texts, the Apocalypse of John, the Gospel of John, and Nicodemus, the Gospel of Nicodemus, all being part of this theology. And again, the reason why Nicodemus is included is because for two reasons. First, just like in the Gospel of John, the Gospel of John makes a very strong push on this idea of two witnesses, with John the Baptist being one of the witnesses, Jesus claiming that he's the other witness, he's a witness to himself, and then you also have Nicodemus as a major character in that book. So I guess he's got all of the bases covered here. He's got Nicodemus as an extra witness if he needs it, I suppose. But this is drawn directly from Revelation chapter 11. Again, two witnesses is not a new idea. He didn't have to put it in the book of Revelation, but he did. And it's one of those curious things because it starts to get into the head of the theologian. He plants this idea into the book of Revelation, book of Apocalypse, which is a book of divination, and then he divines from it to come up with, lo and behold, two witnesses. So it's kind of a fraudulent on his part, the whole mechanics of this thing. But Nicodemus, the reason why we have him there is because he's mentioned. He's a fairly important character in the core of the Gospel of John. And he also satisfies the two witnesses which no other text does this. Only the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Nicodemus do this particular thing, and that's make a big deal out of two witnesses. In the case of Gospel of Nicodemus, the two witnesses are the two people on either side of Jesus. The reason why they're there in the first place, the reason why they're there in every passion narrative, is because they are the witnesses. They were put there by the first theologian in order to give the details of what occurred when Jesus died, between that time and the time that he resurrected. That's the whole reason they existed in this story at all, from the very beginning. And so that's why Nicodemus is included there as well. But getting into the character, the first person that authored these books, his name very likely was not John. That is very, very, very likely. And I had suspected for quite some time that first there were way too many Johns in this theology, and I had suspected that it was very possible, if not likely, in the case of John, for traditions to divide. So you have one character named John, and he splits into two or more characters because of incompatibilities or other circumstances that we'd have to figure out. And in the case of John, that's what I found. There's only one character that the Gospel of John talks about in depth, other than Jesus. And well, I guess there are two characters. You could claim Nicodemus is one of them. Nicodemus and John the Baptist. And so what I would propose is that the initial Gospel of John was claimed to have been authored by John the Baptist, who is a fictional character. What happened when the author wrote the Apocalypse of John? That author did not claim the Apocalypse of John as his own. He claimed that it had been written decades earlier by someone named John. That's why it's written in the style that it is. The author can say, Look what this guy predicted. And when a theologian looks at it, they can obviously see the recent histories there. The eclipse, the sack of Jerusalem, the war, it's all there. So, either you take it or you leave it if you're a theologian, but they can obviously see that it predicted these things, even though it was just written. The theologian wrote it, but he's not claiming it as his own. He's claiming he discovered it, probably, along with the Gospel of John, which the Gospel of John ends up probably in his presentation, it probably ends up predating the apocalypse, even though he extracted the information from the apocalypse. For him, he is authoring a book of divination and then divining from it, and what he divined was the story of Jesus. Then he plants a story of Jesus before the divination it's really weird how it worked out, but he plants it ahead of the apocalypse of John. If you were to ask him which one were written first, he would say it was the Gospel of John, because Jesus then gives the apocalypse after he's resurrected to John, which is assumably the same John as it says in the Gospel of John. John the Baptist was the original John. John the Baptist was the original name of the author for these texts. Now, he didn't author them. There was no John the Baptist at all. We do have some data that suggests that he did exist, but I'll get to that in a moment. He didn't exist at all, but his name was, he was John the Baptist. The Gospel of John, the Apocalypse of John, that John was John the Baptist. Now, I just stated that, and I need to clarify that some to try and explain why I think that is. And like I said earlier, there are too many Johns. You've got John of Patmos, John the Apostle. You've got John Mark, who may have been a real character, actually. John the Baptist. You've got this character called the Beloved that everybody claims is John the Apostle, but nobody knows for sure because it doesn't say anything about it. In that text, the Gospel of John, it only makes a point of one character named John, and that's John the Baptist. There are some apostles, but one thing that had not made any sense earlier, before I'd gotten too far into it, was that in the very first theology, it didn't make any sense that there would be 12 apostles, because in the book of Revelation, it doesn't make a big issue out of the number 12. Yes, 12 is a magic number. Yes, 12 is a magic number for basically everyone on the planet at the time. And so it could have been pulled in, but there was no reason necessarily that there was a requirement for there to be 12 apostles. The only mention of 12 was in Revelation 7, and that was in regards to the 12 tribes, where it says the 12, it broke down the 144,000 resurrected into 12 tribes, 12,000 each. But I suspected strongly that was inauthentic. The breakdown was inauthentic. The number 144,000 may have been real, but the breakdown into 12 tribes may not have been real. And I suspect that because of what later theologians believe the 144,000 represents. It doesn't represent the 12 tribes to certain later theologians that are somewhat anti-Jewish. If it had already stated that these were 12 tribes, it would have been very, very difficult for them to get around that. As it were, I think these 12 tribes were planted in order to wipe out theologies like the Canaanites, who believed that 144,000 were resurrected from before the flood. These were descendants of Cain that had been wiped out during the flood, and they were avenged, essentially, and resurrected. So we've got one character, John, and it says in the Gospel of John, there was a man named John who was baptizing. And we automatically look at it and go, hey, that's John the Baptist. But where do we get that? We get that from all the synoptics. All of the synoptics. Mark, John, Luke, Matthew, and Mark. All of them call this character John the Baptist. What does John say again? John says, there was a man named John who was baptizing. What's the difference? Every single synoptic gospel talks about John the Baptist as if you already know who he is. The Gospel of John talks about this character named John who was baptizing as if you have no idea who he was. It introduces him. There was a man named John who was baptizing, and then it goes on to describe what he did and how he was a witness to Jesus. And again, it makes they push the idea of two witnesses quite a lot, coming out of the apocalypse, the original apocalypse of John. John the Baptist is the next central character, other than Jesus, in this story. This is the book of John the Baptist. There are a couple of other things that didn't make any sense that would be in the first theology. And I just mentioned the idea of 12, and I skipped past it. 12 was not a big deal in the apocalypse, so it didn't make sense. Apostles, it didn't make sense as a term that it would even be used. And in the Gospel of John, it wasn't used. Not one time does it mention the word apostle in John. If you try and count the disciples in John, I think you get to 10. You won't get to 12. It's either 9 or 10. Doesn't really matter. I think it's 10. So, again, you don't have 12 followers here. And it doesn't make sense that there would be necessarily any in the first theology, other than the people who witnessed him. There doesn't make any sense that there would be any followers. So, John the Apostle makes no sense whatsoever. There was another story that kind of ran in conjunction with this story, and that's the Judas story. The Judas story, I believed for several years that the Judas story made no sense in the first theology. Not only does it not come from the apocalypse, but it's a stupid story. The Judas story, it brings up way too many questions about the motives of Jesus. You know, when you select this guy and he's one of the good guys, and excuse me, and all of a sudden he turns out to be evil, it brings up too many questions. But besides all that, you had the Gospel of Judas, and the Gospel of Judas looked reactionary. And what I mean by that is you've got this theology that's just plugging along, doing its own thing. And then this tradition rises up where one of the apostles, Judas, is a traitor. The Gospel of Judas tries to refute that. Had this been in the original theology, I don't think the Gospel of Judas would have been created at all. It's apocryphal on multiple grounds, the Gospel of Judas is, but primarily because the idea of him being a traitor was kind of convenient. Again, a lot of what happens in theology is pure utilitarianism. You know, is it useful? There is no utility whatsoever in salvaging Judas in this story. Lo and behold, in the Gospel of John, which never mentions the word apostle, it only mentions the word 12 one time, one single time. And that one time is in the Last Supper, during the Last Supper, when Jesus is calling Judas Satan. So all of this stuff that I suspected probably wasn't original in the theology all came into a conjunction right here. That chapter of John is thrown out as inauthentic. the Last Supper was not original to the theology. So where did John the Apostle come from if the theology originally was the theology of John the Baptist, as far as the books are concerned? If John the Baptist was the original witness, the original fictional author of the Apocalypse of John and of the Gospel of John, where did John the Apostle come from? And I think you get a hint at it when you look at theologies like the Manichaeans, who believe that John the Baptist was of some importance, but Jesus hijacked the religion. On face value, a theologian looking at the early theology can go many different directions with this. One direction that they can go with it is to say that John the Baptist was a really, really good guy. And, we can make up stories about him and find out more about him. So you're going to find out more about him by asking around and picking up, basically creating, in a lot of ways, new traditions. But this Jesus character was a fraud. So what's happening, I think, very early on is that John the Baptist, who is credited early on with the theology, who is, somewhat credited. They leave it nebulous, but he's credited with the texts of the Gospel of John and the Apocalypse of John. He becomes an almost messianic figure in certain theologies, and in order to get rid of that, they can't get rid of John the Baptist entirely, but they can certainly cut off his head. And that's what they ultimately do. They cut off his head. As time moves on, the 12 apostles are developed and another John is put in his place. Again, we don't have any information on that character. We actually have less information on the Apostle of John than we do on John the Baptist, which we have virtually none on. But we actually have less information on the Gospel of John, other than he seems to be significant. And he is significant because later in some of the synoptics it talks about him and James as the sons of thunder, again suggesting that what they're really trying to say is that they are the sons of the Logos. They are the fathers of the religion, that this religion came out of the Logos. And like I said before, James is a second theology. And then you've got the Gospel of John, Nicodemus, and you've got the Apocalypse of John in the first theology. You have a second theology where someone approximately 10 years later adds material to the Apocalypse, claims that he discovered this new material, and here's what it said. And he probably claimed that there was another character back there named James who wrote the entire infancy in his book. He also writes Acts of Pilate. Acts of Pilate is a kind of a first-hand account from Pilate, who is seen as the good guy here. It probably solves the question of whether or not Pilate was an evil guy. That's probably the primary reason why Acts of Pilate is mentioned. But again, who shows up in Acts of Pilate? Nicodemus, this Jewish kind of an official. He shows up. He's important, just like in the two Johannine texts. So you have a Jamesian theology and a Johannine theology, both of which are Logos theologies, even though, again, James doesn't mention Logos. He just mentions light a bunch of times. The Logos yielding light, which has been known for several hundred years at that point. So, once again, the Apocalypse, or rather the Acts of Pilate, solves the problem of how the Gospels are related entirely. You have the Gospel of John, which yields the Acts of Pilate, and the Acts of Pilate is used as the basis for the first synoptic, which is, as far as I'm concerned, Markion. If we call it any synoptic, it doesn't really matter. Whatever the first synoptic is, they used Acts of Pilate as the foundation for their theology. And then that and traditions to plug in. And then they all fought because they all felt that each other's texts were deficient. That's how you ended up with so many synoptics. Anyway, my battery's about to die, so I better go now. Thanks. Bye.